Well, hello again. Chris Esplin back with more Firebase. Yet again, it's been months, but I'm still here. And Cloud Functions just got released. I mean, that's a pretty big deal. I've talked before about FireStack, this architecture that I really like, where you use Firebase and these reactor functions, and you push data to Firebase and have reactor functions that listen to your Firebase and, of course, react to changes in your database. Now, I've always had to do that with Node, and I've used an NPM module called Firebase Q that lets you write quick reactor functions. But now we've got Firebase Cloud Functions, which is this official way to do reactor functions. And it also does a bunch of different triggers. You've got authentication triggers, you've got Google Pub Sub, of course you've got your real-time database Firebase triggers. HTTP triggers, and a couple other things that I haven't used much myself. I think there's an analytics trigger in there as well. Primarily, I like the real-time database triggers. I've used HTTP a little bit to set up sort of cron jobs, but primarily I like not HTTP. Primarily, I really like the real-time database triggers. So I'm going to go through a little package I wrote that's got some of my favorite functions in it, and how you can implement and test that, and how you can set up a local testing environment to make sure your Cloud Functions work. Because the worst workflow is to make some changes, spend a minute, maybe 120 seconds uploading your functions to Firebase, waiting for them to boot up, testing it, seeing, oh, made a typo, cycle back, make your changes, and then you have this really horrible, long sort of development cycle that makes you miserable. And I've got a way around that using local testing. I've got some mock events and it works pretty well. So let's get to work. Come to your terminal, you get in your folder. There we go. Okay, you see we're right here in this upper level folder. Firebase init. It gives you some options. In this case, I don't want all of them. Let's not use the database. Let's just use other hosting. Let's just use functions. And now I've already done this, so I'm not going to run it. But what it will do is it gives you this Firebase RC. In this case, I've picked my project Quiver 2 and sets up your Firebase.json, which for me is empty because I'm not using hosting and the database. Okay. Also, if you pick functions, it creates a functions folder for you. Now you've got to put all your goodies, all your function stuff lives in here, including your node modules. And say, in my case, I'm using yarn instead of npm now. So your npm, your package.json, all happens inside this functions folder. So cd into functions. There we go. We've got Firebase admin, Firebase functions, and a package that I wrote recently, and I'll walk you through it, called Quiver Functions. And I'll put a link to the GitHub for Quiver Functions. It has its own README. Should be self-explanatory. My goal with Quiver Functions is to just roll all of my favorite functions into a single mono repo that I can quickly import and deploy on all of my projects. Because guess what? You tend to use the same functions over and over and over again. So this is how you deploy a function in this sort of setup I've got. So you've got your index.js right here. And I've got a config.json. Now, Firebase functions will pull in your config.json data, whatever this stuff is, it'll pull it in and make it accessible via functions.config. Other things accessible via functions.config are set in, well, with the command line tool, with Firebase tools. And I'll go over that in a minute. So index.js, the first thing I need functions. Now, real-time database functions have an admin database ref in them already. So you don't need to do Firebase admin work if you already have a copy of the ref with a real-time database event. But I'm going to do two kinds of events. I'm going to do an authentication event, an OnCreate event, and I'm also going to do an OnWrite event. Now, I'm looking at this right now saying, wow, this looks complicated. And it frankly is. You're not going to be successful with this if you don't understand Node.js pretty well. You kind of need to know JavaScript to be successful with this. And I'm sorry about that, but that's the barrier to entry here with Cloud Functions or really anything this sophisticated. Okay, so I'm gonna need to initialize an app. So I'm gonna use admin.initialize app config.firebase. I got my config from functions.config. Okay, functions.config you can call anytime with functions to get your config. And I've had to sort of inject that config in here via config.json. You'll see I've added Firebase right here. This block of config is there by default on Google servers. You never have to add Firebase as your config. And in fact, you can't. If you have the Firebase string in any of your config keys, not values, but keys, it will actually block it and you can't write that. So you can't use the letters Firebase anywhere in your config strings. You can't use it here, you can't use it here. Okay, so what I've done is I've got Firebase functions up here, I've got Firebase admin, and I've got Quiver functions, which is where I've kept my functions. Now I've got my first functions called OnCreate, my second function is called login. And I'm exporting them just as .onCreate and .login. And the OnCreate function, it takes a database. Because it's an OnCreate, it's an authentication event. There's actually no database reference in that authentication event. So I have to pass in my own database reference. So I'm going to create that reference right here, or initialize my admin, then pass in that reference to this OnCreate. And you'll notice I'm doing something pretty similar down here in my login. I've got a user's path config that I need and an admin users array that I need for that as well. Then I go exports.login and I attach it. So functions.database.ref, then I pass in my path, whatever path I want. In this case, I'm going to be adding queue events to Quiver functions, queues, current user /UID. And because I put it inside these brackets, these curly braces, UID becomes a wildcard, a parameter that is available on event.params in the event itself. And we'll see that in a minute. And then I'm listening, in this case, to onWrite. This is a database write event. Then I get my instance of the login, and I get function off of that. So let's go look at login real quick. So login, this is an ES6 or ES 2015 class I'm exporting. It's got a constructor, which takes that config. Config requires user path and admin users and attaches it to this .users path and this .admin users. Pretty straightforward. And then get function just returns a function. So you'll see here, get function, all it's returning is a function. The nice thing is that function has access to, say, this .user path, which I'm going to need. And yeah, when I have one of my users on the client side log in, every time they log in, I have them push their JavaScript web token, their current user from Firebase Auth, to Quiver functions, queues, current user / their UID. Now, my function here, my login function, will then receive all those writes as events. So every time someone writes or changes it, it's an event. And I can call event.data.val to get that user JWT, or JavaScript web token. I can also use event.data.admin.ref to get an administrative sort of super user ref for my database. I can then call .root child, pass in the user's path, .child event params UID. So event.params has the UID on it because I put UID here. If I'd been UID 123, then this would be UID 123. It's that simple. Okay. Now, this event will fire for successful writes, changes. Also, it will fire for deletions. So if you remove the object, it will fire. Now, if there's no user, if there's no value there, I'm just going to return a resolved promise. You always want to return promises out of these functions. So in this case, a resolved promise. So success, it all went great. Otherwise, you want to let your functions, whatever they are, fail and return rejected promises. So for example, right here, I've got userref.update. Well, userref.update, if it fails, it will return a rejected promise. And that's what I want. I want my rejected promises to get returned straight out of the event so that my the logging system that we're running here, that Google Cloud Functions is running, can operate correctly. Okay, so what do we do here? So we get the user data from the event. We get the user ref, which I've got via, well, this is where I want to copy my user data to. If there's no user, we're just going to return a success. Okay, that's great. Skip it. Otherwise, we set the last login, and we check, hey, this.admin users. You may have noticed from, we have an admin users array right here. So this.admin users, if it includes the user email, then I'm going to set isAdmin as true. And then I'll run userref.update, pass in the user, and then I'm just going to remove the event.data.ref. So it will remove this sort of queue item that I added on. So what I want to impress upon you is that Firebase Functions kind of requires a queue system. There's not a lot of state really in the function. You don't want state in your function. You want to do a small amount of work in each function. And if more work is required, you want to push a job to another queue. So you want to maintain this queue system where, let's say I've got my current user queue. So every time a current user, new user, current user, whatever, logs in, they add their JavaScript web token to the current user collection, this queue collection. And then I want to process that. If I have more work to do, like say send an email, I'm not going to send the email out of that particular function. That function will then set another queue job somewhere else. The point being, you want to spread those points of failure out as much as possible. So you don't want your function doing too much. You want to keep your functions as small as you can and just use lots of queues. There's no harm in using lots of queues. So pass jobs from one function to another function to another function so you can assemble a really effective architecture. This makes these functions all reusable. If you try to jam too much into a single function, you're going to run into a problem where all your stuff sort of coupled together. You'll end up duplicating a lot of functionality. You don't really want that. So there are ways to get around this, like using common packages across functions to sort of deduplicate your code, and that's great. But I really just want to impress from someone who's done a bit of this. You want small functions. You don't want them all to be single purpose, and just use as many queues as you have to sort of pass jobs from function to function. And yeah, that way you get failures and you can track the failure down to the exact queue, the function that failed, because the queue job will be sitting there because it wasn't removed, or however you want to manage it. At this point, Firebase Functions is still super up in the air. Like all of Firebase, you develop whatever you want. You put together whatever architecture you want. They've given you the tools, not a lot of direction, go to town. Now, that being said, I've been playing with this quite a bit, and I've come up with a system that I like a lot. So you're welcome to use and extend the system that I've developed. I think it works great. You can clone my repo on GitHub and hack away at it, do whatever you like. And yeah, we can all learn together. Okay, so let's cover the next function. So right here we covered login. Now let's go to the OnCreate. The OnCreate event's a little bit different. You'll notice there's no path to it. It's just functions.auth.user OnCreate, and you pass in some function. There's no path. Before here, you'll notice there's a path, and there are these parameters. We don't have that because this is just for creation. There's an onDelete or onRemove as well. Can't remember what it is. Check the README in the notes. But primarily you'll use this with OnCreate. And actually, I don't love this event because it only fires when a new user signs in. And the reality is you want to be processing something usually for every login the user does. And that's why I prefer to use this login system I've got down here. But if you just want to do something the first time a user gets created, all right, easy way to hook into that with your OnCreate. So functions.auth.user OnCreate, pass in a function. Okay. Here's what that function looks like. My OnCreate class requires a couple things, a user's path and a database, because I'm going to write some stuff to the database. And I need to sort of pass that in here. You'll notice I passed it in right here, admin.database, and I passed in a fully initialized database. I highly recommend, if you're trying to do this, do your database initialization in your index.js and pass it into your functions. You don't want to call .initialize app more than once at all in Firebase Functions. Only ever call it once. Only ever have one active app running at a time. One active, so admin, Firebase admin. Don't try to make multiple apps. I've tried it, total disaster. Doesn't support it well. Okay, so make your database, pass that into your whatever system. In this case, I'm using an ESX class to emit a function. You don't have to do this. This is a little extra sophistication that I've developed over time. Keeps everything really nicely modeled out in terms of JavaScript and good ways to keep JavaScript classes alive and happy. But you can do it however you like. You can write horrible, mangled spaghetti code if you need to. It'll still work as long as you pass in a function. In this case, the function is this guy right here. All it does is it gets the event, and the event doesn't have a lot on it. It just has the current user. It's got their email address and their password and the photo URL, a couple other things, whether the email is verified or not. In this case, I'm just going to take that. I'm going to call got config, and let's see. You know what? I don't even need this anymore. That is extra code. There we go. We've got a user's path, and so I'm going to get the user's ref using event.data.uid. The event.data in this case being the user object, right there. Event.data.uid. Got a user's ref, and I'm just going to copy that user over there. Just update it, and that's that. And this returns a promise, and so we're happy. These functions are pretty simple. There's nothing fancy going on. I'm just getting some data, processing it, writing it out to Firebase. Great. It takes a while to develop these things because you don't have a good emulation of the Firebase Functions, Cloud Functions environment on your local machine. So how are you going to do that? You need a testing framework. So I've put together a quick little testing framework, and I've attached it to my Quiver Functions library. So you can use it as well, or build your own. It's not that hard. It just took me a couple hours to build mine, so I figured I'd publish it. You want to do all your development with the testing framework locally, push it up, make sure it all works, adjust your testing framework if necessary, and once you get all your functions working, your testing framework working, you can develop the functions, make them more sophisticated with local tests to make sure they actually work before you push them up. I also recommend do your tests at a slightly different path than your actual Firebase functions up in the cloud because it's hard to turn them off. So if you're doing a bunch of testing, you could accidentally be triggering those functions out in the cloud. Disaster. You have no control. I mean, you've got too many things writing too much data and they'll all mix each other up. So don't have multiple functions and tests running off the same bit of data. It's just, it's messy. Don't do that. Let's talk over then. Okay. Let's go over my testing framework and how I use it. And yeah, I'm using Jasmine in this case. You can use Mocha or any other testing framework. There are a lot of them. It's not super fancy. It takes a little configuration. But what I've done is I've pulled in my admin, and I've kind of done the same sort of had the same steps I did in index.js, where I had to initialize these things. But it's a little trickier because I got to initialize them. I pull in Quiver Functions, I get login, I get my OnCreate, and then I'm going to call in my mocks off of quiverfunctions.mocks. Right now, I've got two different kinds of mocks. I've got a mock DB event and a mock auth event. That's the crux of this whole thing. You're going to be calling the function yourself in the test. You're not letting Google call the function. You're calling the function yourself. So you have to pass in a reasonably well mocked event into your function to then see how it reacts. And that is the crux of everything. It's getting a good mock. So I've got my mocks here. I'll post a link to the GitHub so you can look at that code, write your own mocks, improve upon mine, whatever you need. You just read the docs and make sure your mocked event matches the docs, and then do some iteration. You make your functions work locally. You push them up. If they break, then my mock's probably wrong. You change your mock, get the mock right, and once your mocks are good, you can roll. All right. So what have I done here? I've got my OnCreate function. I've got my mocks. I'm going to need Lodash for some good functionality there. I'm going to initialize my admin, get my database, and get a root ref. In this case, because we're running tests, I'm going to run it all off of Quiver Functions/test. Put it under test so it doesn't fight with anything else. I'm going to use a mock user for both of these tests. And because I don't want to accidentally overwrite the object, Power Ranger boy brief and underwear with a red Power Ranger that comes with it. Felix will flip his lid. Awesome. I'm shooting a video right now. I'm using a mock user with a UID, email, password, display name, photo URL, disabled, email verified. This just looks like the current user you see on your client app, your JavaScript web token that you get from Firebase authentication. And what have I done? I've got a cleanup function here, which just removes everything from my root ref. Just wipes it out, cleans it up. So before each function, I'll clean it up. Sorry, before each test. And after everything's done, I'll clean it up anyway. And first, we're going to describe the login. I've got some sort of initialization variables here that I'm going to initialize before every test. In this case, I set up my login function. I make a copy of my user, my mock user. I'm going to call it fake user. I get a user's ref. I pass all that in to my mock DB event. The mock DB event that I created, you can create your own, requires a login queue, the one it's going to be listening to, as well as any parameters, in this case UID, and the user itself that it's going to write. So all that will be on the login event. So when I log in, right down here, I can then get my login function, pass in the login event, and respond to the successful, hopefully, promise. In this case, I'm going to check to make sure that the user ref.onceValue will return a snapshot of whatever's written. We want to make sure that that's written and that the fake user UID is correct. So let's walk through this. I'm going to put a breakpoint here and a breakpoint here. Great. I'm going to run my tests in the debug mode. Great, okay. We're stopped here. And let's refresh this. I have a feeling it has gone into hibernation. There we go. So you'll see I've written, my login event has written users fake UID, has written this data here. So I'm going to test it. Awesome. Then I'm going to call done. And before I call done, let's put a breakpoint down here. And another one here for our next set of tests. Just let that play out so it'll delete itself as it should. Excellent. Now we're back here. We're going to run our OnCreate function with our OnCreate event that, again, I've mocked here with an Auth event, a fake Auth event. Let that play through. Great. So that does its work. And is it going to fail? Looks like it's going to fail. Yep, user's null. That's going to fail. Suspect that things are running out of order with Jasmine, and Jasmine is just being buggy. So let's let it play through. You'll see it fail. There we go. It failed. So let's take off all of our breakpoints and run it again. It should do this much faster, and hopefully everything will be in order and everything will succeed. Correct. There we go. So it didn't like that I put breakpoints in. Jasmine doesn't do particularly well with that, apparently, and runs things on top of each other. So that's an issue. Anyway, there we go. All right, moral of the story, what we've learned. Firebase functions, 2 huge thumbs up. I've used AWS Lambda. It works fine. Got no problem with it. But this works really nicely, and it integrates so tightly with Firebase. So you get this great database to functions integration. You don't even need Node.js. Frankly, I just don't write regular server code anymore. I just write these Node.js functions. That's it. Piece of cake. What else? What else is there? Okay, queues. Focus on queues. You want lots of queues. Don't try to hold a lot of state in your functions. Keep the functions small. Create lots of queues. Everything that happens that needs a server response can just be a new queue item. Also, you can just listen to regular database operations as you do them, and maybe your functions can just react to that. So you change your name in one spot, and your function can go change it in the other 5 spots that it needs to be changed. Because you've noticed with Firebase, data fan out can be an issue. Well, guess what? Firebase functions does all of your fan out for you. Piece of cake. All right, what next? Oh, cannot forget, testing is critical. You have to start off with tests. Write a simple function, just make sure it works. Write a simple mock event, set your tests up, get your local testing framework in place first. You kind of have to do test-driven development with this. If you don't do sort of a TDD or BDD or whatever, write your tests locally, you're going to be absolutely miserable. I did a lot of investigation to learn how to do this by just pushing random functions up, seeing if they worked. Find out, hey, half of them don't. Getting those errors, looking at the logs, it's a big pain in the neck. So get your local system up and running. I've got all the stuff up on GitHub so you can go through it. Read the docs on Firebase Functions. They're not hard, they're really, really short. That is kind of the biggest problem. They don't give you enough guidance. They just give you the tools and say, hey, go figure the rest out yourself. So you can follow this architecture I've created if you like. Read those basic short little docs up on Firebase. And you know what else is there? Play around. Let me know what else you'd like to see. I can still shoot some of these videos. I'm working a lot these days, but I can take some time off to do videos. And hit me up on Twitter. Please, of course, subscribe to this channel of mine. And let me know what you think about Firebase Functions, what you think about Firebase, if there's anything new you've played with. And yeah, see you next time. Okay, what have we learned? Okay, what have we learned from this whole adventure? We've learned that Firebase Functions is awesome. I mean, I've used AWS Lambda, works great, kind of similar, but it doesn't have this awesome database integration like Firebase Functions does. That's 2 huge thumbs up for me. It's pretty easy to work with. Now, I haven't shown how you deploy this. I haven't shown you how to do config. Read the docs for that. It's all really simple. I've actually done a whole write-up on it, and you should be able to find that on howtofirebase.com pretty soon here, as well as, of course, in the README on the GitHub repo that I just posted. So find it there, learn all this stuff, subscribe to this channel, and profit. Awesome. Thanks a lot for watching. See you later.